Hello, this is Greg with the Chronicles of Aeres, and this is episode number 3 of the Aeres Chronicler, which is my review show where I interview independent creators and personalities that don't get a lot of screen time. Um, I've already done a couple of interviews. Check out my channel on YouTube for those. I interviewed the creator of Kaiju Days, which is a comedy comic book, indie comic, and also an artist with his own who specializes in mecha art. Today I have Matt Kraft, also known as Krafty Matt, and I wanted to bring him on as kind of a special guest today to talk about his experiences with competitive gaming. Now, if you're on the Twitter sphere or in other forums or Discord areas, you may recognize him as an avid tabletop role-playing game player or commentator in some spaces, but he actually has an extensive history in the competitive gaming world, especially in the fighting game world. And I thought that would be interesting to talk about today because a lot of those people have kind of dropped off the radar in the past 10, 20 years. It used to be a big popular thing. It still is. EVO is a huge tournament, and there's Tekken tournaments that are still going on to this day. But definitely late 90s, early 2000s probably was the peak. But yeah, I have Krafty here today. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing good. Welcome, everybody. This is Matt Kraft. I do that every single time I get on the mic. Now, as far as the competitive video game sphere, honestly, it's first-person shooters and things like that that really peaked in the 90s and in the early 2000s. But fighting games are actually seeing probably the biggest surge of competitive fighting games that you have ever seen. EVO Japan just happened. You had a tournament that was just on the Ivory Coast. This weekend is Combo Breaker in New York, or Chicago. Sorry, it's huge. I mean, fighting games right now are gigantic, but that's really not where I entered competitive gaming.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. I don't know much about it and that's why you're here today, is to help provide some insight and guide us a little bit as an audience. Now, I was into it in the early 90s when Street Fighter 2 was the thing. And that was the big thing. And Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo came and went, and eventually got to Street Fighter 3 and Street Fighter Alpha 2 and all those. That was my era. Although I was never a competitive fighting game player, I was more of a Killer Instinct guy. I don't know. I don't even know if Killer Instinct ever was competitive. I don't think so.
It is.
But today in the competitive world, I watch a lot of StarCraft Brood War Classic, one of the earliest games to really launch competitive gaming as a scene, especially in Korea.
Yes.
But what were some of your earliest memories of the arcade? How did you get introduced to this world that you stepped into?
I mean, like any kid in the 90s, an arcade was just almost a way of life. If you ever went to a movie theater, you ever went to a pizza parlor, there was an arcade. And the pizza parlor that was near us was My Buddy's Pizza. They had an extensive arcade in the back that was filled with all sorts of games. I mean, we're talking like and everything from, pinball machines to like the old Ninja Gaiden, the arcade version of that was there. There was a Neo Geo cabinet there, and then of course there was Street Fighter and other things, right? But honestly, that most of the games that I played at the time was games like Contra, Castlevania, most of your NES games. And then this guy named Reggie brought his Super Nintendo to school for Friday Fun Day in history class. It was the last Friday of every month, and he brought Street Fighter 2. And after that, I was pretty hooked on competitive fighting games.
Cool. Well, yeah, Street Fighter 2 for Super Nintendo was a major big deal. And I remember waiting in line. I was very young at the time. My parents were gracious enough to allow me such a violent video game. Of course, this was slightly before Mortal Kombat. They would learn that it would get a lot worse, although the Super Nintendo Mortal Kombat, as we all know, is a major disappointment.
And it's a major disappointment because of all that,
Yeah.
So the Jack Thompsons of the day, and of course, I mean, there's always been controversy in video games, and arcades were no different. A lot of arcades disappeared from shopping malls and from other scenes because they were often seen as places where gang members used to hang out and deal drugs, and fights would break out and things like that, right? But
And
in
they were.
reality, well, I mean, they were, but in reality, a lot of the places were where young boys. Well, I was a teenager at the time, and young boys such as yourself, we would gather to play the latest video game. There was there was nothing at home other than maybe a Neo Geo, which you had to be super rich to own one of those. But there was nothing at home that was anything like what you could play at an arcade. And so if you wanted to see the latest video games and you wanted to do that, you went to the arcade. And sure enough, there was always some beast that was on the arcade. For me, it was a guy named Matt Shear. He was the Mortal Kombat guy. And there would be a line of quarters across the bezel
Yeah.
for the person who's next. But then I discovered Unreal Tournament and Quake.
Same
And
here.
yeah, and so my competitive shifted there, and that was about that was 99 when that happened. And I got to the point where I joined a competitive group called the Weekend Warriors. The Weekend Warriors are not around anymore, I don't think. But the Weekend Warriors used to be up there with groups like SK, Ninjas in Pajamas, and all those guys. If you recognize any of those names, and the Fatality Group, if you recognize that name from the early
Yeah.
90s. One of the guys that was in the Weekend Warriors, his name was Jeff, and Jeff said, "Hey, you've got a really good voice. I want you to go and I want you to talk to this guy named Hunter, Hunter Lewisi, and then I also want you to talk to a guy named Jeremiah." And I went and I talked to them. They said, "Hey, you've got a really good voice. How would you like to do a broadcast with Jeremiah? It's an Unreal Tournament broadcast." And I said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." So I got on there. And back in the day, there was no YouTube. There was no Justin TV. It was, you had to log into the game as a spectator, and you had to call the shots like it was a radio show because there was no video on demand either.
Chopper did take the lead back, and it is incredible to see, Alex, because these guys really have been working hard at this. You know, these guys are good friends, and it's got to be kind of rough to be sitting in their heads and stuck inside the bottom of their throats that they want to try and get to this $20,000. In the lead right now in the yellow car, in the yellow Radical SR3 Turbo. Here comes the final lap here. We're doing 3 laps. This is the final. They are neck and neck. He does a little bit of a bumper car.
You had the play-by-play guy, and then you also had the color commentator, and I was very good at color commentating. And then from there, it launched this whole thing for me with a company called the Team Sportscast Network. And I was with the Team Sportscast Network, which used to be known as the Tribes Shoutcast Network. I was with them from 99 until 2007. And I've done video game broadcasts for everybody from ESPN2 to CBS College Sports, Microsoft's Voom network. We partnered with MTV, and the Team Sportscast Network has gone around the world, everywhere from from Sweden down to Chile to China, Korea, of course, New York. You know, it was a huge thing back in the day with because you had the World Series of video games, you had the Cyber Athletic Professional League, you had the old Cal leagues. I'm sure that this all sounds familiar to you. And
Right.
then in about 2005 is when Evo started getting really big. Well, Evo, you know, because before that it was known as Battle of the Bay and all of that kind of stuff. And then I want to say in 03 is when Evo Moment 37 happened. But around 2005 is when fighting games started getting really big. And I said, "Hey, we need to start covering this." I was station manager at the time, and Hunter and some of the other guys said, no, we're going to stick with first person shooters, and we're going to stick with strategy games, because Warcraft and Starcraft were still big in the competitive scene. And unfortunately, in 07, MTV bought controlling interest in the company, and then fired everybody and installed their own VJs because they thought they could do it better, and the company just went under.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
Now everybody knows TSN as that Canadian sports channel.
If anyone wanted listening to go back and hunt down some of the tournaments where you were commentating, is it possible, or are they floating around out there somewhere?
And within seconds, again, Fudo has gone from lubricated to ludicrous.
Yeah, and I mean, and you're gonna have that happen because here's the reality. When it comes
Right.
to offensive, well, overall, Fudo is just a stronger opponent, but it makes it really skews.
Again, it's it is pre YouTube and pre Twitch, so finding that stuff is very difficult. But
Right.
you can find the World Series of Video Games tour. I'm behind the mic and behind the camera because, again, I'm station manager at that time. But if you look up Team Sportscast Network 2005 highlights on YouTube, and Greg, I can pass you the link to that. But that shows, basically what it was like for us. And I mean, it was for video games, and in 2005 we were rock stars.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah,
Now,
go ahead.
I came from the StarCraft world and StarCraft Brood War. I played a lot of tribes too. I played the Shifter mod,
Yeah,
which was not competitive. The Shifter is very silly, but it was fun.
right.
But from my experience, now, for example, Sean Plott, who we know as Day 9, won the World Cyber Games tournament for StarCraft Brood War. And
Mhm.
after that, he became an analyst, commentator. And, in the real-time strategy world and first-person shooter world, I see that a lot. You usually start high as a player, and then you kind of retire, and people ask for your opinions as a commentator. Were you a competitive player before getting into the tournament scene?
I was with again with the Weekend Warriors. I was competitive in Unreal Tournament. I was an individual competitor in Tekken 3. I mostly did local tournaments around Southern California, which everybody knows is Southern California is one of the largest meccas
Yeah.
for fighting games. So I did Tekken tournaments at Cal State San Bernardino, Cal State Fullerton. Which I wanted. I mean, those are places that everybody knows where those are. And then, of course, when Wednesday night fights came around, I did Wednesday night fights, but I transitioned pretty early into doing commentary on that, and then I would basically do tournament play on the side. So unfortunately for me, I never got to win any tournaments, but that's because my focus was more on doing actual commentary.
Sure.
The last professional commentary I did was in 2014, because I did 2014 for the Sega Cup in Virtua Fighter 5, because 2013, 2014 they had this huge Sega Cup tournament at Super Arcade, which is in Walnut, California. It's where Wednesday night fights happens. And unfortunately, that place closed down because, again, city council thought that people were doing drugs and hanging out and
Right.
fighting and drugs and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't, right?
No.
But Wednesday night fights is an interesting thing, right? So Wednesday night fights, for people who don't know, is it was an arcade. You show up and you put $20 into a pot. $10 goes to the arcade, $20 goes to a pool. So for Street Fighter 4 at the time, you could have 200, 250 competitors show up. So that's a lot of money, right?
Sure.
And then Virtual Fighter was a side tournament. Tekken was a side tournament, but most of the Tekken players, like Aeres and Rip and all them, they were playing Virtual Fighter because Tekken 7 hadn't come out yet. It was still Tekken 6 and Tekken Tag 2 Tournament 2, and nobody really liked those games. and so they were playing Virtua Fighter at the time. And then of course, you also had your Marvel 3. Nobody really played Marvel Infinite. When Street Fighter versus Tekken came out, that lasted maybe a week or two. But yeah, it's competitive fighting games. It runs through my veins, and just competitive gaming runs through my veins. Just that entire scene. And am I still involved in the scene? Yes. Where I can be, absolutely. Work of course has taken that away, and unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, but really fortunately, a wife and 2 kids who are both now graduated took my focus away from competitive gaming. But I wouldn't change any of that.
Right, of course. Hey, that's important too. Um, so when you were involved with some of the big boys back during that time, do you have any stories you can share about maybe going to Japan or Korea, some of those experiences? Did you ever get to do that?
No, I never got to go to Japan or Korea. I wish I would have, but to go there, you had to know the language. I did
Right.
not. I did not know the language. Got to go to Brazil. That was pretty cool.
Cool.
So
Fighting
and
games are
then
still huge there.
Oh, and they're huge, especially like King of Fighters. Oh my God, I mean, gigantic there. And then got to go to I got to go to New York, and then of course Texas for the big finale in Texas. So I have gone. Let's see, where else have I? Mexico. Went to Mexico, which again is huge for fighting games, but Mexico is practically my backyard, so that's not saying much.
Right. So, and I mentioned that a lot of commentators do sometimes begin as professional players and transition after they retire.
Oh,
But,
Turkey. Got to go to Turkey.
oh, wow. Okay. That's
Uh,
interesting. What games were being played in Turkey?
That at the time was a game called Painkiller. So
Yeah.
just brief history. Quake 3 got so big that id Software decided to start charging LAN centers and charging tournaments to actually run the game. And so a couple of the ex-devs from id Software made this game called Painkiller, and that became like the big tournament game. Oh, Barcelona too. God, man, so long
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. It's been a long time. Did you ever dabble on the side into any real physical sports like commentating for boxing or UFC, anything like that?
No, but I did do Olympic Taekwondo, and I got black belt in that. I have several gold medals. I only received 1 silver medal and 1 second place trophy in the decade that I did that. I had to stop that because I injured my back, and couldn't do competitive sports anymore. But I probably have 20 plus medals and various trophies.
Oh, that's fantastic. Certainly more than most people can say. Um, Now, I'd like to segue that you've given us a lot of good history about where you came from, how you're still involved, and what you were involved in. But I'd like to segue into the second part of the interview, which is more of a philosophical take. And you've had a lot to say on the internet. It's been private forums and also on Twitter and other places about the competitive spirit, how to win at games, how to be a winner, pushing aside challenges and overcoming obstacles. Can you tell us some more of your thoughts about what it takes to be a winner in any game, not just fighting games?
Well, when people say, when people think of you're a winner, they think that you're winning. You're constantly winning, right? You win this tournament, or you win that, or you win this fight, and if you lose, then you're no longer a winner. And that is true. But true winning is focusing on yourself, right? It's being better tomorrow than you were today, and that is walking a path. That is setting aside all of the negativity that surrounds, like people telling you, "Oh, you're not good. Oh, you're a loser. Oh, you're not playing it right," and setting that aside and really focusing on the game or the sport, or even the instrument if you're playing an instrument, right? And
Right.
it is focusing all of your attention on that. It's what some people call the path of mastery, but I call it the path of winning, right? Is that you keep going, right? And you dive deep into whatever it is that you want to master. If it's fighting games, then let's say it's Tekken, right? Then you need to learn the frame data. Okay, you need to know how far away you are from a wall. You need to know if you tech a throw and you get a launcher, what can I do after that?
Right.
It's so much more than just winning a round. It is actually digging deep into the game. And once you've dug deep into the game, and this goes for role-playing games as well and tabletop games, is you have to dig into the rules. You have to extract the those obscure rules from the game that most people don't like to play, and find out why the creators put them in there. And once you figure out why something is in there, that is winning, right? Because then you can start playing the game on the fundamental level, and it changes the game. And really the game kind of goes into the background, and it's almost like seeing the Matrix. It's weird, but
It makes sense. And it's funny because, of course, tabletop role playing games are a bit of a different beast, but many of the same analogies apply to tabletop role playing games. It's all about the rules. In the fighting game world, there's no fudging of dice. There's no cheating. In some countries, if you're caught cheating, you go to jail, right?
right. Or worse, it depending on what neighborhood that you're in. But in fighting games, right, there is the call of the scrub, right? So, and you've heard me in private and on Twitter say about a scrub. So a
Right.
scrub is not somebody who is not good at a game, right? A scrub is not somebody who can't play or is just learning. No, a scrub is somebody who makes excuses for their gameplay, or assigns their excuse to another person. For example, in Street Fighter, if you get somebody into a corner and you corner trap them and corner trap throw, the scrub will say, "Why are you throwing so much? Throwing is cheap." Well, it's part of the game. I know, but next round, nobody can throw. Well, no, that's throwing out a rule. But they'll say that, nope, nope. The only reason that you won is because you're using cheap tactics, right?
Yeah.
So in tabletop world, it's tracking arrows and tracking food and water is not fun. Well, okay, it may not be fun at the time, it may not be fun in the moment, but when you finish that adventure and you're like, oh man, we were out of water. If Bob didn't go out and hunt that elk, the entire party would have wiped from starvation. We barely got back into town, but you know what? We were able to save that girl. That's fun, right? Because you're using the rules and when you use the rules correctly, the fun emerges, right? Or on the opposite side of that is you learning the rules and you digging into the rules and you discussing the rules with other people, like almost like a common language. That becomes the fun, right? The moment to moment fun no longer matters, because that overall sense of accomplishment, that overall sense of winning is now the fun.
And the creators of most games, including tabletop role playing games, now I can't say all creators of games are like this, but when they put rule systems in their games, they don't intend, they're there for a reason. They don't intend for players to ignore them or not read them. In fact, it's almost insulting from a creative standpoint for someone to just ignore the system you've created and do their own thing, because that system contributes to the setting. It's there to help you with immersion. It's there to provide you with a backdrop for how to play the game and have fun at the game. And there's definitely a lot of separation between someone who plays and plays and plays a ton, and someone who has the mindset to really get there. Um, so what are your thoughts on complexity? Now I'm kind of wind back a little bit and go to a little bit back to the fighting game world, but in the fighting game community, as well as in tabletop role-playing games, there are simple games and there are complex games. You can do a lot in Killer Instinct. It's more complex than people give it credit for, but of course, combos are automated. What are some of the most technical games, the hardest games for you to analyze in your history?
Well, this is actually perfect, right? So a simple game would, a lot of your simple games on, like, if you remember Saturday Night Slam Masters, right? A
Yeah.
lot of people would say that's not a fighting game, right? But it kind of is, or some of your old Art of Fighting games, right? Uh, they're not that complex. If you've ever played Nidhogg, right? That game is not that complex. That's the fencing game, right?
Mhm.
It's not that complex of a game. Um, and so you can have fun with those games, but they're very easy to deconstruct. And once you have deconstructed a game, and it basically boils down to, okay, well, if I do this all of the time, I will win, then the game falls off very quickly, right? Whereas a game like Street Fighter 2, say Super Turbo, right? But especially games like, let's say, Third Strike, or we get into, say, Tekken, right? Tekken 8 now is an
Yeah.
extremely complex game. And then you want to get like stupid complex, like you almost need a master's degree complex, is Virtua Fighter, right? Because there's always situations where it's like, oh, I'm always learning something new. Even top players always say, oh man, I'm always learning something new, right? Um, so in role playing games, right, you have, if you start stripping out all of the complexities in a game, then the game is, again, it's fun in that moment, but it will not last, right? There is a reason why people are still playing games of, say, Blackmore or first edition D&D, because of the complexity of those games. You hear stories of people playing 40-year campaigns. And I'm not talking about the people who say, "Oh, I've been playing for 40 years." I'm
Right.
talking about the campaigns that have lasted for that long. And the reason that they have lasted for that long is because the games are so complex that you're always learning something new, you're always doing something new, and there's always something new to discover. Whereas, and I'm not trying to poo-poo 5e, right? Because 5e can be a complex game, but most people have stripped out so much of 5e that it is no longer a complex game, and therefore sessions only last 6 sessions.
And a lot of people who do this type of thing get very defensive and angry if you try to question it or ask them about or confront. Have you thought about exactly what you're doing? It's just a different type of mindset, I suppose. Now, when I was a little kid playing Street Fighter 2 on Super Nintendo, I loved it. I was addicted to it. But as a 40-year-old guy, I I can't play it anymore because as you get older, you realize that although at the time it seemed like you were playing as close to an arcade perfect game as you could think of as a kid, you realize the more that you see developing over time that it's lacking a lot of the stuff that made Street Fighter 2 a complicated game. And so I would only play the arcade game now. It's got to be as accurate as possible.
And there's ways for you to do that too. With Fightcade, you can actually play people all over the world, and the arcade ROM of, say, Street Fighter 2 or Super Turbo. A lot of people play Hyper Fighting,
Yeah,
and then but you can play all of those using Fightcade, and so people are still playing those games so many years later, right?
of
Whereas
course.
people are not playing Kung Fu, or they're not playing
Karate
uh,
Champ.
Karate Champ, exactly, right? Because there's only so much that you can learn from those games, right? And this is why I think that people still play 1E, whereas not as many people play 2E, Dungeons and Dragons, right? Because 1E is complex, right? And even BX is complex. But go over to 2E, and what they tried to do with 2E is they tried to remove a lot of that complexity. And in removing a lot of that complexity, it was a very short lifespan of a game. Then comes 3E. 3E arguably had the longest lifespan other than 5E, because when you include Pathfinder in there, which I do because Pathfinder is essentially 3E, right?
Right.
Then 3E has the longest lifespan of any version of Dungeons and Dragons. And why is that? Because it is so complex, it is so rules heavy, and it is so dense that people are still learning things. Even though it's a game that I don't like to play, people are still learning things and learning ways to do things in that game so many years later.
It's funny. I see a lot of people, Mortal Rising, who you may be slightly familiar with. He's a streamer. He does indie comics and Comicsgate type of stuff. He still plays third edition. And there seems to be this trend among the hardcore third edition people who started playing that in 2000 or whenever it came out. They're still playing it. And it's like they just ignored everything that came afterward because it's such a heavy game that they just keep playing 3, and they're like, oh, I didn't know there. I talked to one guy who didn't even know there was a 5th edition because he didn't care. He just kept playing
Right.
3rd edition.
Well, and I imagine that in 2040, you're going to have those 40-year-old 3rd edition grognards that say, hey, man, we've been playing this game for 40 years. Why do we need something new? Right. And that's because of the density of the game. And that's because those people that still choose to play that game, they're walking that path of winning. Right. You can't win at a tabletop game. There's no winning at a tabletop game. The only way that you win at a tabletop game, right, is if the campaign keeps going, you RTFM, and you challenge yourself to master the game. And a lot of these people don't understand game mastery, right? And not game mastery as in the game master, but we're talking mastering the rules. Everybody says, well, I don't like when the rules get in the way, and I want to make sure that, the rules just fade into the background. Well, how you do that is you do that through game mastery and book control. You learn the rules so well that it becomes second nature, just like in a fighting game, where it's, oh man, I got to do quarter circle forward and punch to throw a fireball. You go from, oh man, I got to throw a fireball, to this is when I throw a fireball, or this is how I punish. Not these are the buttons I need to punish. It's I will use it in this situation, right? And so that is where reading the manual and book control becomes so important, because once you have mastered the game at that level, then the rules take that back seat, and then you're actually playing the game.
Right. A lot of new players to any game tend to fall into a trap where I think that they believe they need to improve their tactics and strategy. And that's often, and I saw this a lot in the StarCraft Brood War world, that's the wrong mindset. The fundamentals are really what's important. You have to master your macro. You have to master the fundamentals of the system in the game. And you can win games in StarCraft solely based on being good at macro and having more units than your opponent. Forget strategy, forget tactics, forget builds and all of that. If you can have just more units than your opponent, you're going to win. And
Right.
A lot of people don't seem to realize that you need to build that foundation, the muscle memory, know your hotkeys, know your combinations and moves. You have to master that in order to move on to strategy, in my opinion.
Right. You can watch Justin Wong's combos. You can watch Daigo's combos. You can emulate their combos, but all you're doing is emulating their gameplay. You are not playing the game. You are letting Daigo play the game through you. And honestly, a copy of a copy is it's never going to be the best, right? So you need to learn how to play the game and how to master the game. It's just like when you go on to RPG Net, or you go on to forums, or you go on to YouTube, and you see, oh, top 10 builds to frustrate your GM. Okay, well, you're copying somebody else's gameplay, you're copying somebody else's style. You're not developing your own style. Or you have the top 10 things you need to be an awesome dungeon master. No. the only thing you need to be an awesome dungeon master is you need the dungeon master's guide and a will to be good, right? And a drive to be good.
Yeah, the game gives you all the tools you need to succeed. So,
but it's are you putting in the work? Are you trying to be better than you were yesterday? That is the most important thing, right? Now, yes, study how other people do things, right? Go to other people's games and learn how, say the basic expert, how he dungeon masters, or how you dungeon master, or how crossface dungeon masters. Learn those things, right? But develop your own style. Because if you don't develop your own style, then you'll never walk the path.
right. And on that note, before we close up the interview for today, I did have another thought maybe you can comment on. What would the advice you would give to a player who's not completely new at the game and not a scrub, but they are trying very hard. They're giving it their all. They're trying to go the distance, and they're working hard. They're doing everything they know how to do to learn the fundamentals, and they just can't get there. There's like a block. They're just running into a wall. Have you ever seen that? What would be your advice to overcome that?
I've been there. I'm kind of there right now in Tekken, and that is just it's lab really. It's one, don't give up. Don't ever give up, right? If something is frustrating you, step away for a minute, right? Listen to some good music, but most importantly, it is especially in today's fighting games, is watch your replays. You will find your own mistakes in your own replays, and I don't think people use a practice mode or a replay mode enough. And you have to. It's everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to go play somebody and I'm going to go beat up on somebody for the next hour and then I'm going to quit. No. What you have to do is you spend half that time playing and then the other half of the time analyzing. It's just like lifting weights, right? You lift weights and then you have recovery, right?
Yeah.
Or it's just you go out on an operation, you come back, you have a debriefing, right? You have to have that moment of reflection, right? So, and it's the same thing in tabletop games, right? It's after a game is over, go back, review your notes and go, oh man, I could have run this so much better. And honestly, again, it's don't go out and find other people's advice, right? Other people's advice is great. Other books are great. But honestly, every tool that you need is in the game itself. And most importantly, how do you get over a block? Is you find a community. If you do not find a community of like-minded individuals to discuss with and to practice with and to play with, and that goes with anything, that goes with chess, that goes with fighting games, that goes with tabletop games, don't be that guy that just goes and plays on random ladders or goes on to Roll20 and is trying to matchmake looking for a game. No, you have to find a community, and it is the community. And I'm not talking about like the tabletop community on Twitter. I'm talking an actual community where
Sure.
you can talk with like-minded individuals. A great example of that is the Basic Expert and Associates. I feel like an imposter there. Okay?
Really?
I do. Okay, so let me break this down for you, right? I appreciate you greatly having me on your show. I am not a creator. I'm not a content creator, right? The Basic Experts and Associates has grown a little bit, but it started off as a gilded for creators and content creators and game devs. So I felt like that drunk guy that crashed the party and then just never went home.
Good analogy, but not quite.
Right. But that's how I feel, right? But again, in finding that community, right? I have found other like-minded individuals, and my game has grown because of it, right? And my tabletop game has grown because of it. In the Tekken community, right? I still try to get out to Wednesday night fights and all of that kind of stuff. There's a community there, right? I see the same people. We talk, all of that kind of stuff. It's super important, right? Because that's going to be you can measure yourself up against online opponents, or you can measure yourself up against what you read in a book, right? But until you actually go out and you have a community and you play with other people, you're never going to know, right? So the community. And then the final thing is how do you get over a block? Go to tournaments, right? You may go 2-0 in a tournament, and you may go 2-0 in 3 or 4 tournaments. But it's that 5th or that 6th tournament where you're going to win one round and you're going to go, man, I'm winning, right? I'm walking that path. I'm better than I was yesterday. And that's how you get over the block.
Hey, that's really great advice. And of course, some communities can have toxic people in them. You just have to expect that in any kind of gaming community. But if you make friends and acquaintances and get into the community and participate, people will have your back. You're not going to just have an all toxic world around you. You've got people who will support you and be behind you and help you. So that's definitely great advice to have. But again, Matt, I appreciate you coming on to the show, and your insight has been very interesting and helpful for us today. Not many people know about the competitive fighting game world, and you've brought a lot to the table for that. So I appreciate you having me on. Before we wrap it up, do you have, I'm going to put links to where to find you on social media, your Twitter. You can message me some links to some of those things you mentioned earlier in the stream, like where to find you elsewhere. Did you have anything else to promote or anything you don't like to tell us about yourself?
Sadly, I don't. I am going to try to get a Conan game going soon. So if that's something that people want to play, Conan is a very different game than what most people play, and I just think that it would be cool. But as far as where I am on socials, you can find me on Twitter at Krafty Matt Kraft. I don't really have a YouTube. I don't have anything, but I am around. Everybody knows me as the read the effing manual guy. That's me.
Of course. All right. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot again. And we hope to catch you around on the flip side.